Sir, if one piece of evidence worries you this much, what are you trying to hide?
One flash drive can't destroy everything I've built. Can it?
Drop the evidence, officer, or tomorrow you'll wish none of this ever happened.
Drop the camera, officer, unless you're ready to lose everything. The words echoed through the narrow service alley behind the old warehouse, calm enough to sound rehearsed, confident enough to suggest the speaker believed every syllable. Officer Naomi Brooks didn't answer. She simply kept one steady hand on the small evidence camera clipped to her duty vest while the other rested naturally near her radio, her breathing slow and controlled despite the growing circle around her. For strangers blocked every clear exit, their expensive jackets strangely out of place against cracked brick walls and rusted loading docks. They smiled the way people smiled when they assumed the outcome had already been decided. Rain from an earlier storm still clung to the pavement, reflecting the glow of a flickering streetlight and the blue pulse of a patrol cruiser parked nearly 50 feet away. Somewhere beyond the alley, traffic continued as though nothing unusual was happening, the distant hum of engines blending with the soft rattle of a passing freight train. Naomi's dark uniform carried tiny droplets of water that shimmered under the light, but her posture never changed. She had spent enough years wearing uniforms to understand that fear often arrived long before danger did, and panic usually belonged to the people who underestimated the person standing in front of them. Earlier that evening, the call had seemed routine. An anonymous report had led officers to an abandoned distribution warehouse on the edge of the city, where financial records connected to an ongoing corruption investigation had supposedly been hidden before they could disappear forever. Most responding officers had searched the building. Naomi had volunteered to secure the surrounding property, quietly documenting vehicles, footprints, and anything that might later answer questions no one had thought to ask. It was there, tucked beneath a loose section of wooden pallet near the loading dock, that she found a small waterproof case containing a flash drive, handwritten notes, and a company access badge belonging to someone whose name had already appeared in several confidential reports. She photographed everything exactly as protocol required before sealing the evidence. She never imagined someone had been watching every step. The men surrounding her now wore polished watches, spotless shoes, and expressions that belonged more comfortably inside luxury boardrooms than abandoned industrial streets. Their leader, Ethan Caldwell, adjusted the cuff of his tailored coat before offering an almost friendly smile. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said. "Hand me the camera, walk away, and tomorrow nobody even remembers tonight happened." Naomi studied his face without hostility. Years in law enforcement had taught her that people often revealed more through patience than confrontation. "Evidence belongs in court," she replied evenly, "not in someone's pocket." A brief silence settled over the alley. One of the men laughed quietly, shaking his head as though amused by a child refusing simple instructions. Another glanced toward the cruiser before returning his attention to Naomi. They clearly believed numbers alone created authority. None of them noticed the tiny body camera indicator still blinking beneath the edge of her jacket. None of them recognized the disciplined stillness in her stance. They saw a black woman standing alone at the end of a long shift. They assumed exhaustion would outweigh conviction. They assumed isolation would replace courage. What they couldn't see was the discipline forged years earlier under a different uniform, beneath blazing southern training fields where every sunrise demanded endurance before breakfast and every lesson ended with one truth repeated until it became instinct. Remain calm, protect others, and never surrender your integrity because someone louder believes they deserve it. Ethan took one slow step forward, convinced the distance between confidence and control was only a few feet. Naomi didn't move an inch. The rainwater beneath their shoes reflected the flashing lights like scattered pieces of broken glass. And for the first time that night, the certainty on Ethan's face began to flicker almost as noticeably as the street lamp above them. Before we continue, if you enjoy powerful stories that reveal the strength of the human spirit and the choices that shape our lives, subscribe to Narralight. Every story has a lesson, every choice has a consequence, and sometimes the smallest moment changes everything. Now, let's see what happens next. Naomi Brooks had learned long before she ever pinned on a police badge that people usually announced themselves long before they revealed their intentions. Some spoke with respect. Others spoke with arrogance. Ethan Caldwell spoke like a man who had never been told no. His polished shoes stopped a few feet away from the shallow puddle separating them, and he folded his hands as though the entire encounter were nothing more than an inconvenient business meeting running behind schedule. "You are standing between yourself and a very comfortable future," he said with a measured smile. "Nobody has to know what was inside that case." Naomi met his eyes without raising her voice. "That decision stopped being yours the second those records became evidence." The air seemed to grow heavier. A cold breeze drifted through the alley, carrying the scent of wet asphalt and the distant aroma of fresh coffee from an all-night diner 2 blocks away. Somewhere nearby, a train horn echoed across the river, its lonely sound cutting through the silence before fading into the night. The men exchanged brief glances, each waiting for someone else to take control of a conversation that was no longer following their script. They had expected hesitation. Instead, they found patience. They had expected emotion. Instead, they found discipline. Naomi had not always possessed that kind of calm. 20 years earlier, she had been a shy teenager growing up in Savannah, Georgia, raised by her grandmother after losing both parents before high school. Her grandmother used to tell her that character was what remained after fear had finished asking its questions. Those words followed Naomi through every difficult season of her life, from college to the United States Marine Corps, where discipline became something deeper than routine. Every morning before sunrise, while the sky still carried shades of deep blue, she learned that confidence was never loud. It was built mile after mile, decision after decision, until staying calm became more natural than giving in to panic. She never talked much about those years. Most people at the department only knew she had served honorably before becoming a police officer. Few knew she had spent countless hours helping younger Marines develop confidence under pressure, reminding them that real strength was measured by restraint as much as determination. After leaving military service, she chose law enforcement for one simple reason. She wanted children growing up in neighborhoods like hers to see at least one uniform that represented fairness instead of fear. Some days were difficult. Others were heartbreaking. Yet she still believed every honest conversation, every patient response, and every act of integrity mattered more than people realized. Ethan studied her expression carefully, almost searching for frustration that never arrived. "You really think this changes anything?" he asked quietly. Naomi answered with the same steady tone. "Truth usually does." One of the men shifted uneasily before leaning toward Ethan. "She is not bluffing," he whispered. "If she already logged the evidence, we have a problem." Ethan dismissed the comment with a slight wave of his hand, but the confidence in his smile no longer reached his eyes. Across the alley, the patrol cruiser continued flashing silent blue reflections across brick walls and rain-soaked pavement. The body camera beneath Naomi's vest captured every word without drawing attention to itself. She knew procedure. She knew patience. Most importantly, she knew that every extra minute they remained focused on convincing her, instead of leaving, created another minute of recorded evidence. She was not trying to win an argument. She was allowing the truth to introduce itself one sentence at a time. For the first time since surrounding her, the men began looking over their shoulders instead of directly at her, and Naomi recognized the moment immediately. Confidence had started giving way to uncertainty, because integrity had one advantage deception could never borrow. It did not need to remember what it had already said. The silence stretched just long enough for everyone to hear the faint crackle of Naomi's shoulder radio. No dispatcher spoke. No backup announced its arrival. Yet the sound alone reminded every person standing in that narrow alley that time never truly stood still. Ethan Caldwell slowly slipped one hand into the pocket of his tailored overcoat and exhaled through a practiced smile. "Officer Brooks," he said, speaking her name for the first time, "you have an impressive reputation. Former Marine. Commendations. Community service awards. People respect you. Why risk all of that over one camera?" Naomi did not answer immediately. A single drop of water slid from the brim of her patrol cap onto the pavement below. She watched it disappear into the shallow puddle at her feet before lifting her eyes again. "Because it is never just one camera," she replied. "It is every person who expects the truth to matter after tonight." Ethan's expression hardened for only a fraction of a second before settling back into polite confidence. "You still believe the system rewards honesty?" Naomi tilted her head slightly. No, I believe honesty gives the system a chance. Behind Ethan, one of the men quietly removed his phone and glanced at the screen. His face tightened. Sir, he whispered, stepping closer. The warehouse security network came back online about 15 minutes ago. Ethan looked at him without speaking. Some of the exterior cameras may have recorded everything before we arrived. Another man immediately answered. Facilities said those cameras have not worked for months. They said, the first replied, not guaranteed. The uncertainty spread through the group almost invisibly, like cold air finding its way beneath a closed door. Naomi noticed it without changing her posture. Fear often arrived quietly. Doubt arrived even quieter. She had seen both during disaster relief missions overseas, where entire crowds could shift direction because one person stopped pretending to be certain. Her instructors had once taught that leadership was not about controlling people. It was about remaining steady while everyone else searched for something solid to stand on. Those lessons had followed her into every patrol shift. A neighborhood dispute, a missing child, a traffic accident. Every situation asked the same question in different ways. Who remains calm when everyone else cannot? Ethan took another careful look at Naomi. Something about her composure no longer made sense to him. Most people cornered by four determined strangers eventually began explaining themselves. They negotiated. They justified. They pleaded. Naomi had done none of those things. She simply stood there as though she already understood something no one else did. Tell me something, Ethan finally said. What makes you so certain someone is coming? Naomi's answer came almost immediately. I never said anyone was. One of the men looked instinctively toward the mouth of the alley. Another checked the empty sidewalk across the street. Ethan frowned, realizing they had all reacted to an assumption she had never made. She had quietly shifted the pressure without taking a single step. The flashing blue reflections from the patrol cruiser continued dancing across the wet brick walls, creating moving ribbons of light that made every nervous glance easier to notice. Naomi's body camera remained fixed exactly where department policy required, silently preserving every conversation, every hesitation, every attempt to persuade an officer to surrender evidence outside legal procedure. She knew those recordings often revealed more than dramatic confrontations ever could. Sometimes the smallest pauses exposed the biggest truths. Somewhere above them, thunder rolled softly beyond the clouds, not close enough to threaten another storm, but close enough to remind everyone that nature never hurried for anyone. Ethan slowly removed his hand from his coat pocket, empty this time, and studied Naomi with a different expression than before. It was no longer amusement. It was calculation. For the first time that evening, he began considering the possibility that the woman standing quietly beneath the flickering streetlight had anticipated far more than he ever expected. The confidence Ethan Caldwell had worn all evening no longer looked effortless. It looked maintained. There was a difference. And Naomi Brooks recognized it immediately. Real confidence stayed quiet. Manufactured confidence required constant repair. A cool breeze swept through the alley, lifting the corner of a discarded newspaper before carrying it toward the empty loading dock. The flashing blue lights from the patrol cruiser continued to wash over the damp brick walls, painting the scene in slow waves of color that seemed to measure every passing second. Ethan glanced briefly toward the entrance of the alley before returning his attention to Naomi. You are making a mistake that cannot be undone, he said. You still have time to make a smarter choice. Naomi answered with the same measured calm that had never left her voice. Doing the right thing usually feels expensive before it proves its value. One of the men sighed with visible frustration. She is not listening. Another quietly replied, she does not have to. She already made her decision. Those words lingered in the cold night air longer than anyone expected. Ethan turned toward the speaker with an expression that suggested disappointment more than anger. Even within his own group, certainty was beginning to fracture. Naomi noticed every small shift. A nervous glance, an uneven breath, a tightening jaw. Years of service had taught her that people under pressure rarely lost control all at once. They surrendered at one tiny decision at a time. She remembered standing on a windswept training range years earlier while a Marine instructor repeated the same lesson until every recruit could recite it from memory. The first person who loses emotional discipline has already surrendered the advantage. At the time, she believed it applied only to military operations. Later, she discovered it applied equally to ordinary life. Neighborhood disputes, court testimony, family emergencies. Every difficult moment rewarded patience over pride. Ethan slowly reached into his coat once more, but instead of removing anything, he simply folded both hands together in front of him. "Let us pretend," he said with an almost conversational smile, "that whatever is on your camera changes everything. Investigations take years. Lawyers delay them. Witnesses disappear. Public attention moves on. Is one officer really going to stop all of that?" Naomi looked toward the rain-covered pavement for only a heartbeat before lifting her eyes again. "One honest officer cannot solve every problem," she said. "But one dishonest officer can create thousands." Nobody answered. The silence itself became heavier than any argument. Somewhere in the distance, church bells quietly marked the hour. The sound drifted across the sleeping city, soft enough to be almost forgotten, yet impossible to ignore once heard. Ethan lowered his eyes for the first time that evening, studying the reflection of the flashing patrol lights rippling across the puddles between them. It was as though he had finally realized this encounter was no longer about convincing Naomi to surrender evidence. Every additional minute placed more words on official recordings. Every unnecessary statement strengthened a timeline that investigators could later reconstruct with remarkable precision. Naomi had never rushed the conversation because she never needed to. Truth aged well. Deception rarely survived its own details. One of the men quietly cleared his throat. "Sir," he said, barely above a whisper, "we should leave." Ethan did not answer immediately. His polished shoes remained planted on the wet concrete as he weighed choices that no longer seemed as simple as they had only minutes earlier. Naomi remained exactly where she had stood from the beginning, shoulders relaxed, breathing steady, her attention fixed not on winning, but on preserving the integrity of the evidence entrusted to her. The alley itself seemed suspended between two futures, one built on influence and the other on accountability, while the soft pulse of blue light continued reflecting across rain-soaked brick like a quiet reminder that every night eventually gives way to morning. Before we continue, if you enjoy inspiring stories about courage, second chances, and people who choose kindness when it matters most, subscribe to Narralight. Our stories remind us that one decision, one voice, or one act of compassion can change a life forever. Now, let's see what happened next. The first sound that broke the silence was not a siren or a command. It was the quiet vibration of Ethan Caldwell's phone inside his coat pocket. He glanced at the screen for barely a second before locking it again. But Naomi Brooks noticed the subtle change in his expression. The confidence that had carried him into the alley was now competing with something far less comfortable. Time. It was no longer working for him. The cool night air settled over the empty warehouse district, carrying the scent of damp concrete and old timber, while the steady flash of blue patrol lights reflected across every rain-soaked surface. Naomi remained exactly where she had been from the beginning, her evidence secured, her shoulders relaxed, her attention focused not on the people surrounding her, but on the responsibility resting on her badge. She knew the easiest way to lose perspective was to make a confrontation feel personal. This never had been. The truth belonged to the public, not to either side standing in that alley. Ethan slipped his phone back into his pocket and forced another polite smile. "You still have not considered what happens tomorrow," he said. "Investigations create headlines. Headlines create pressure. Pressure reaches families, careers, and reputations. Are you prepared for all of that?" Naomi answered without hesitation. "Every officer should be." One of the men standing beside Ethan shifted uncomfortably before speaking in a lower voice. "This conversation has gone on too long." Another quietly nodded in agreement. They had entered the alley expecting a quick resolution. Instead, they found themselves trapped inside their own choices, each additional minute producing another recorded statement, another piece of context, another thread investigators could later follow. Ethan looked toward the patrol cruiser once again. "Do you honestly believe your department will protect you?" he asked. Naomi paused for only a heartbeat. "I did not become a police officer because protection was guaranteed. I became one because service matters even when it is difficult." Her words carried no anger. They carried experience. She remembered her grandmother standing on the porch of their Small Savannah home years earlier after Naomi had returned from a difficult day at school. People cannot decide your worth unless you hand them the pen, her grandmother had told her while watching the evening sun settle behind rows of oak trees. That lesson had followed Naomi through every chapter of her life. Through military training, through long patrol shifts, through moments when strangers judged her before learning her name. She had discovered that dignity was never something another person could give or take. It was something quietly practiced every single day. A distant engine echoed through the warehouse district before fading again. None of the people in the alley could tell whether it belonged to a delivery truck, another patrol unit, or someone simply passing by. The uncertainty changed everything. Ethan noticed it too. For the first time since confronting Naomi, he stopped trying to persuade her and started studying every possible exit from the situation. The men beside him followed his eyes almost instinctively. They were no longer focused on the evidence camera. They were focused on consequences. Naomi watched without satisfaction. She had seen enough lives damaged by pride to celebrate another person's fear. Accountability was never about humiliation. It was about allowing facts to stand where influence could not. The blinking indicator beneath her vest continued recording quietly, preserving every word exactly as it had happened. Ethan drew a slow breath before looking directly at Naomi once more. There was no smile left now, only calculation mixed with growing uncertainty. For the first time that night, he realized he was not facing someone trying to outsmart him. He was facing someone who had already decided that integrity was worth more than comfort. And that was the one kind of resolve money had never learned how to negotiate with. The alley grew strangely quiet after Ethan Caldwell stopped speaking. Even the wind seemed to soften, carrying only the gentle rustle of leaves from a row of neglected maple trees beyond the chain-link fence. Water continued dripping from the warehouse roof in slow, steady rhythms that sounded almost like the ticking of an invisible clock. Naomi Brooks closed her eyes for the briefest moment, drawing one slow breath before opening them again. She did not do it because she was afraid. She did it because years of discipline had taught her that the clearest decisions were made by people who never allowed the moment to control their breathing. The blue reflections from her patrol cruiser rolled across the wet pavement like quiet waves, turning the ordinary concrete into a shifting mirror. Ethan and the men beside him remained where they stood, yet something fundamental had changed. The confidence that had surrounded them only minutes earlier had dissolved into restless silence. Nobody seemed eager to speak first anymore. Naomi could almost hear the questions forming behind their eyes. How much had been recorded? Who else knew about the evidence? How quickly could everything unravel? She understood those questions because she had asked different versions of them herself many years ago, standing beneath an endless Carolina sky during one of the hardest weeks of Marine training. Her instructor had watched exhausted recruits struggle through another long day before saying something she never forgot. When pressure gets loud, your values have to become louder. At the time, Naomi believed those words were about military service. Standing in the quiet alley years later, she finally understood they were really about life. Uniforms changed. Jobs changed. Circumstances changed. Character was the only thing expected to remain the same. She reached up calmly and adjusted the small American flag patch stitched neatly onto her shoulder. The familiar fabric beneath her fingertips reminded her of every promise she had made, first as a Marine, later as a police officer, and always as the granddaughter of a woman who believed integrity could outlast almost anything. Her grandmother had never cared about titles or recognition. She cared about whether people could still look themselves in the mirror after making difficult choices. That lesson had become Naomi's quiet compass through every challenge. She looked toward the evidence camera secured safely to her vest. It was only a small piece of equipment, hardly remarkable by itself. Yet tonight it represented something much larger than photographs or recorded statements. It represented trust. Every family expecting fairness. Every witness hoping someone would listen. Every child watching a police officer and wondering whether honesty still mattered. Those thoughts settled over her with surprising calm, washing away the last traces of tension that had lingered since the confrontation began. Ethan noticed the change immediately. Instead of looking cornered, Naomi somehow appeared more peaceful than before. That unsettled him more than any argument ever could. People who relied on intimidation usually understood fear. They rarely understood conviction. One of the men quietly shifted his weight before asking, almost under his breath, "Why is she so calm?" Nobody answered because nobody standing there truly knew. They had mistaken composure for uncertainty, silence for hesitation, patience for weakness. They had measured Naomi by appearances instead of principles. Far above them, the heavy clouds slowly began to separate, allowing a narrow beam of moonlight to slip between them. It settled across the rain-covered pavement beside Naomi's boots, mixing with the soft blue glow from the patrol car until the ground itself seemed brighter than before. She took another slow breath and waited without resentment, without triumph, and without anger, because she had learned long ago that truth never needed to shout. It only needed enough time to be seen. The first sign that the night had changed did not come from the people standing in the alley. It came from the quiet crackle of Naomi Brooks's shoulder radio. "Unit 12, status check." The dispatcher's calm voice floated through the cool night air before fading into silence again. Naomi pressed the microphone without taking her eyes off Ethan Caldwell. "Unit 12, I am secure. Continuing evidence preservation." Her answer was short, professional, and deliberately ordinary. Yet the effect on the group in front of her was immediate. Several faces shifted. They had expected desperation. Instead, they heard routine. Ethan slowly looked toward the patrol cruiser, parked near the entrance to the warehouse. Its emergency lights continued flashing across the wet pavement, painting every brick wall with slow blue reflections that made even the smallest movement impossible to hide. He realized something that had escaped him until now. Naomi had never acted like someone waiting to be rescued because she had never believed she needed rescuing. She had trusted the process from the very beginning. One of the men quietly leaned closer to Ethan. "We should leave," he whispered again, this time with unmistakable urgency. Ethan ignored him. "You planned this," he said, studying Naomi carefully. She shook her head. "I followed procedure. You knew we would come." "No." Her answer remained steady. "But I knew evidence makes people nervous." Another long silence settled over the alley. Somewhere beyond the abandoned warehouses, the distant sound of another patrol vehicle drifted through the city streets, too far away to identify, but close enough to remind everyone that the night was still moving forward. Ethan folded his arms. "You keep talking about procedure. Tell me something. Why did you never back away?" Naomi looked at the waterproof evidence case resting safely beside her boot before answering. "Because this stopped being about me the moment I found it." Ethan frowned. Anyone else would have protected themselves first. Naomi smiled gently, not with pride, but with quiet certainty. "My grandmother taught me something when I was a little girl. She said courage is not pretending you cannot be afraid. Courage is remembering who depends on your decision after the fear passes." Those words seemed to settle over the alley more heavily than the damp night air. Even the men standing beside Ethan lowered their eyes for a moment. They had expected arguments about authority, politics, or reputation. Instead, they found themselves listening to simple convictions that money could not purchase and influence could not imitate. Then another sound reached them. Tires rolled slowly across wet pavement before stopping near the mouth of the alley. No sirens. No dramatic arrival. Just the quiet opening of vehicle doors followed by measured footsteps. Ethan instinctively glanced toward the entrance. Two detectives wearing plain jackets stepped into view, followed by a uniformed sergeant carrying a tablet. None of them rushed. None of them raised their voices. The lead detective looked first at Naomi, then at the evidence camera attached to her vest. "Officer Brooks," he said calmly, "your live body camera transmission reached the command center 23 minutes ago. Internal Affairs requested we preserve the entire scene exactly as it is." Ethan's expression changed completely. "Live transmission?" he repeated almost under his breath. Naomi nodded once. "Department policy for high-risk evidence recovery. The recording has already been securely archived." The detective glanced toward Ethan and the others before looking back at Naomi. "Everything from the moment you arrived has been preserved." The words landed with remarkable quiet, yet they carried more weight than any threat ever could. Naomi never celebrated. She never looked triumphant. She simply released a slow breath she had been holding since the anonymous call first sent her to the abandoned warehouse. The moon finally emerged from behind the clouds, reflecting across the rain-covered pavement as though the night itself had decided there was nothing left to hide. Morning arrived without fanfare. The rain had disappeared, leaving the city washed clean beneath a pale golden sunrise that reflected from office windows and damp sidewalks alike. By 8 o'clock, investigators had already begun carefully reviewing every recording captured during the previous night. The body camera footage, the warehouse security system that unexpectedly came back online, and Naomi Brooks's documented evidence formed a timeline so consistent that no one needed dramatic speeches to understand what had happened. Facts spoke more clearly than emotion ever could. Detective Laura Bennett quietly organized each piece of evidence, while forensic analysts verified timestamps down to the second. Every photograph matched Naomi's written report. Every recorded statement fit perfectly into the sequence preserved throughout the encounter. Across town, Ethan Caldwell sat inside a conference room that suddenly felt much smaller than it had only a day earlier. The polished wood table, the expensive artwork, and the floor-to-ceiling windows could not soften the weight of reality now resting before him. His legal advisors no longer discussed strategies for avoiding questions. They discussed cooperation. The confidence that had once filled the room had been replaced by long pauses and carefully chosen words. Outside the police headquarters, reporters gathered behind designated barriers, hoping someone would comment on the developing investigation. Naomi quietly entered through a side entrance instead, carrying the same evidence case she had protected throughout the night. Her uniform was pressed, her boots freshly polished, and her expression unchanged. She acknowledged the front desk officer with a warm smile before signing the evidence into official custody exactly as department procedure required. Several younger officers watched from across the hallway. One of them, Officer Daniel Ortiz, approached carefully. "Ma'am," he said, "I watched part of the footage this morning. I just wanted to thank you." Naomi looked slightly surprised. "For what?" "For reminding people what this badge is supposed to mean." Naomi smiled gently before shaking her head. "The badge only matters if the person wearing it remembers who they serve." Daniel nodded quietly, carrying those words with him long after she walked away. Later that afternoon, the chief of police met briefly with Naomi in his office. Sunlight filtered through partially open blinds, drawing long lines across the polished wooden floor. The chief placed a folder on his desk before speaking. "You handled extraordinary pressure with remarkable professionalism." Naomi folded her hands calmly in her lap. "I followed policy, sir." He smiled. "That is exactly why this matters." He paused before continuing. "People often believe integrity is demonstrated through dramatic moments. In reality, it is demonstrated through ordinary decisions repeated consistently." Naomi thought of her grandmother again, standing on that quiet porch in Savannah years earlier, reminding a young girl that character was built when nobody seemed to be watching. She realized those lessons had quietly shaped every decision leading to the warehouse, the alley, and this very office. Before leaving, the chief offered one final observation. "Your report never focused on yourself. It focused on protecting the investigation." Naomi stood and adjusted her uniform. Because the investigation was always the important part. As she stepped back into the hallway, conversations briefly paused before continuing naturally. There was no applause. No celebration, only respectful nods from colleagues who now understood that true courage rarely arrived with dramatic words. It appeared instead through calm choices made under pressure, through patience when others expected anger, and through quiet integrity that refused to disappear simply because the night had become difficult. Naomi returned the nods with the same humility she had carried since the beginning, knowing that justice was never about defeating people. It was about giving truth enough room to stand on its own. 3 weeks later, the warehouse district had already returned to its familiar rhythm. Delivery trucks rolled through the industrial streets before sunrise. Workers unlocked loading bays, and the alley where everything had changed looked almost ordinary again. Rain had long since washed away every footprint, yet the decisions made there continued moving through courtrooms, investigation rooms, and quiet conversations across the city. The official inquiry expanded steadily, guided by documented evidence rather than speculation. Individuals who had attempted to interfere with a lawful investigation were held accountable through the legal process, while every finding was supported by recordings, verified reports, and witness statements. Naomi Brooks never followed the headlines closely. She preferred beginning each morning the same way she always had, arriving early enough to watch the first light spread across the parking lot outside the precinct before the city fully awakened. She believed sunrise was a quiet reminder that every new day offered another chance to choose integrity. On one cool Monday morning, she stepped out of her patrol vehicle carrying a simple cup of black coffee. The breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass from the park across the street, and the American flag above the station moved gently against a clear blue sky. Officer Daniel Ortiz was already waiting near the entrance. "Good morning, ma'am," he said with an easy smile. "Ready for another ordinary day?" Naomi smiled back. "Those are usually the best kind." As they walked inside, a young girl no older than 12 stood quietly in the lobby beside her mother. She wore a school backpack that looked slightly too large for her shoulders and held a folded piece of paper carefully in both hands. The moment she recognized Naomi, her eyes brightened. "Officer Brooks?" she asked softly. Naomi knelt slightly so they could speak at the same level. "That is me." The girl handed her the folded page. Inside was a simple drawing made with colored pencils. It showed a police officer standing beneath a bright sunrise while children played safely in the background. Across the top, written in careful handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for reminding me that brave people can also be kind." Naomi remained silent for a moment, her eyes resting on the drawing before looking back at the young girl. "Did you make this?" The girl nodded proudly. "My teacher said heroes are people who help others even when nobody is watching." Naomi smiled warmly. "Your teacher sounds very wise." The girl's mother stepped forward. "She watched the news with me. She wanted to meet you because she said you looked calm when everyone else looked worried." Naomi gently folded the drawing and held it with both hands as though it were something priceless. "Sometimes staying calm is another way of protecting people," she said. "It helps everyone make better decisions." Before leaving for school, the young girl gave Naomi a quick wave. "I want to become a police officer someday." Naomi's smile grew even warmer. "Then remember something my grandmother taught me. Your character will always matter more than your title." The girl nodded before disappearing through the station doors with her mother. Later that afternoon, Naomi pinned the drawing beside her desk where she could see it every day. It rested beneath an old photograph of her grandmother and beside the small Marine Challenge coin she had carried for years. One reminded her where she came from. The other reminded her what she had promised. As the evening sun poured golden light across the precinct windows, Naomi quietly adjusted the badge on her uniform, picked up her patrol keys, and walked back toward her cruiser. The city around her continued its ordinary routines, unaware that the greatest victories rarely arrived with applause. They arrived in quiet moments, when one honest decision inspired another, when dignity answered prejudice with grace, and when kindness proved that true strength never needed to announce itself. The patrol car eased onto the street beneath the fading light, and for a long moment nothing could be heard except the gentle hum of the engine carrying another ordinary officer toward another opportunity to serve. If this story meant something to you, subscribe to Narralight for more powerful stories that remind us to look beyond appearances, challenge prejudice, and never underestimate the impact of doing what's right. Because sometimes, the smallest act of courage creates the biggest change. Thank you for watching. Remember, the world changes one choice at a time. We'll see you in the next story.